Why did Avery start finding buttons in the most unexpected places after his mother's death? Who was leaving them and why? And how did one of them lead him to a person who knew too much about her? A lonely boy sat on the steps of a small house with peeling paint, holding a tin box in his hands. It was old, with a faded design of flowers, almost invisible beneath a thin layer of rust. Inside the box lay his most treasured possession, buttons. He didn't know how many there were, but each one had a story. There was a blue button, like a tiny piece of the sky, which he had found the day he saw a rainbow for the first time. There was a pearly, almost translucent one, like a drop of morning dew. He had picked it up on the day he cried, because one of the kids at school called him strange. And then there was a small wooden button with uneven edges, not pretty at all. He had found it near his mother's favorite chair, just a few days before she was gone. The boy's name was Avery. He was 8, but sometimes he felt much older. He believed that his mother, even after leaving this world, continued to send him signs, leaving buttons in his path. None of the adults understood this. They simply looked at him sadly, sometimes with pity, but he didn't want their pity. He knew. Every button he found was her way of telling him she was still near. Today, Avery was searching for buttons again. He walked through the narrow streets of the small town, peeked under benches, ran past stores with large display windows. He was looking for something special, though he didn't know what exactly. Just as he was about to go home, he saw it. A small red button with a tiny white pattern in the center. It lay on the wet pavement near the park, as if someone had carefully placed it there just for him. Avery picked it up, clenching it in his fist, and smiled. He knew his mother had thought of him again. But then he noticed something strange. On the pavement near where the button had been, there were faint footprints, as if someone had stood there, unmoving, watching the road. They looked fresh, as if the person had only just left. His heart started beating faster. He looked around, but the street was empty. The rain was beginning to fall, washing away the footprints. Avery clutched the button even tighter. Who had left it? Why here? And most importantly, was it really a sign from his mother? Or was someone watching him? For the first time in a long while, he felt a slight shiver, but not from fear, from something else. As if something important was waiting for him ahead. Something he could not yet understand. The next morning, Avery woke up with a lingering sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Thoughts of the button he had found, of the footprints on the wet pavement, wouldn't leave his mind. He lay with his face buried in the pillow, remembering how his mother used to tell him bedtime stories. He wished he could hear her voice again. Slowly, he sat up in bed and opened his tin box. The red button lay among the others, standing out like a bright spot. It felt like more than just a random find. Maybe it really was a sign. Maybe his mother knew how much he missed her? Avery ran his finger over the button's smooth surface and sighed. Hope lived in his heart, but so did a growing unease. Had someone left it there on purpose? If so, why? Deciding that he wouldn't find any answers sitting at home, he got dressed and stepped outside. The park was covered in morning mist, raindrops sliding off the trees as if mirroring his thoughts. He walked slowly along the paths, scanning every detail as if searching for a clue. When he reached the spot where he had found the button, his heart stopped for a moment. Something was different. The place looked changed, as if someone had been there again. The footprints on the pavement were still there, but now they seemed smudged, as if someone had tried to erase them. Avery crouched down and ran his fingers over the damp concrete. A fresh wave of anxiety washed over him. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew he had been here. And then in the shadows of the trees, something glinted. His breath caught. He moved closer cautiously, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed impossible no one else could hear it. There among the wet leaves lay another button. This time it was blue, a deep shade of evening sky. Avery picked it up, and in that moment, an eerie feeling washed over him. As if someone unseen was watching him. As if he had become part of something bigger. Something that was only beginning to unfold. He clenched the button in his palm and looked around. The wind rustled the tree branches, and the world felt far too quiet. "Mom, is that you?" he whispered, but no one answered. Now he knew one thing for certain. This was not just a coincidence. And he had to find out the truth. The next day, Avery returned to the park. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him was calling him back. A strange feeling stirred within him, part fear, part hope. It felt as if walking away without understanding what was happening would mean losing something important. He walked slowly along the path where he had found the blue button the day before. His heart beat faster than usual. The wind rustled the bare branches, making it seem as though the park was breathing along with him. Avery had the unsettling sense that he wasn't alone. It was as if someone invisible was walking beside him. And then, through the morning mist, he noticed a figure sitting on a distant bench. An elderly man, wrapped in a worn-out coat, hunched over, his gaze lost in the emptiness before him. He didn't move, only his fingers turned something slowly in his palm. Avery froze. His heart seemed to hold its breath. This man. He looked as if he had been waiting for someone for a very long time. Cautiously, the boy took a step forward. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He clenched his fist around the button in his hand. Maybe this was just a random passerby? Or maybe he knew something. As if hearing his thoughts, the man turned his head slightly. His eyes were weary but warm. There was something strange in them. A mixture of sadness and kindness. "You're looking for buttons, aren't you?" the man asked suddenly, his voice soft but piercing. Avery flinched. How did he know? The boy swallowed. Yes. The old man nodded, his fingers still moving slowly. Now Avery noticed what he was holding. A button, old and worn, its edges chipped and faded. "You've found others before, haven't you?" the man continued. Avery didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, feeling a growing heat of curiosity inside him. The old man sighed and ran his finger over the surface of the button in his hand. "Sometimes we are left signs. We see them, but we don't always understand what they mean." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes they lead us to where we are meant to be." Avery squeezed his button tighter. He felt that this conversation mattered, but he didn't yet understand why. "Who leaves them?" he finally asked, almost in a whisper. The man looked at him carefully, as if weighing his answer. "Someone who loves but cannot be near." The words cut through Avery like an icy wind. His breath hitched. He didn't know what to say. His mother. Could it really be her? Or was it someone else? The man gave him a sad smile, as if he already knew what was running through the boy's mind. "I will tell you a story," he said quietly, "but only if you are ready to hear it." Avery swallowed hard. He knew there was no turning back now. He sat down beside the man on the bench, feeling the world around him fall silent. He was ready. The man remained silent for a long time. It was as if he was carefully selecting his words, sifting through them in his mind before speaking something important. Avery could feel the anticipation in the air, a tension that made him suddenly uneasy. But it wasn't fear of the unknown. It was the fear of hearing something that could change everything. "You were very young when you lost her, weren't you?" the man finally spoke, his voice soft, wrapped in the warmth of old memories. Avery nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't like talking about his mother with strangers. They usually just nodded sympathetically and looked away. But this man didn't seem like he was about to pity him. There was something different in his eyes. "Your mother, she was extraordinary," the man continued. "Her smile could light up any room. And she loved buttons." Avery held his breath. He had never heard anyone talk about her like this before. Everyone he knew always spoke of her with sadness, with a quiet sorrow in their voices. But this man spoke of her as if he could see her standing right in front of him. She always said that buttons were little reminders of people. That even when something is lost, a button remains like a trace, like a memory. He paused, looking at the boy. "You believe that too, don't you?" Avery nodded, unable to say a word. His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he refused to blink. He was afraid that if he closed his eyes, this moment would disappear like a dream. "You know, I once found a button too," the man said quietly, staring into the distance. "And it changed my life." Avery clenched his button tightly in his palm. He wanted to know more. He felt that this story was part of something bigger, something that connected him to this man and to his mother. "Tell me," he whispered. The man smiled, and something warm flickered in his eyes. He nodded. "All right, kid. I'll tell you everything." He sighed and leaned back against the bench. His gaze drifted over the autumn leaves scattered along the path, like tiny fragments of memories. "A long time ago, when I was a little older than you, I had a sister," he began. "Her name was Margaret, but everyone just called her Maggie. She was the kindest girl I had ever known. We were inseparable." Avery listened, his eyes locked onto the man's face. Something inside him stirred, something warm, almost painful. "Maggie had a tin box full of buttons. A small blue one," the man continued. "She collected them just like you. She used to say that each button was a memory of a person, of a day. Sometimes she even made up stories about them." He smiled, but a shadow passed over his face. "The year she turned 10, she got very sick. It happened suddenly. No one expected it. She spent a lot of time in the hospital, and every time I visited her, she asked me to bring her buttons. I found them everywhere. On the street, at home, at friends' houses. She said that if she gathered enough, maybe she would get better. She called them buttons of hope." Avery felt his fingers tremble as he gripped his own button. This story felt too close, too real. "But one day," the man paused, looking into the distance, "I came to visit her with a new button and she was gone. She left me her box, asking me to continue her tradition. And ever since then, I've been leaving buttons in different places for those who might need them, for those who are looking for a sign, for those who need hope." Avery took a deep breath. Now he understood. These buttons, they weren't just random finds. They were something much more. The man looked at him with a gentle smile. "And now one of them has found you. Maybe you're the one who's meant to carry this forward." Avery didn't know what to say. Something inside him was shifting, unfolding. He looked down at his button, remembering his mother, her hands, her voice. Could she really be sending him signs? Or was it his turn to do the same for someone else? "I don't know," he whispered. The man placed his own button in Avery's palm. "No one ever knows for sure. But you get to choose." Avery looked at him, then at the button. And in that moment he understood. His mother had never truly left. She was in his memories, in his heart, in these small things that connect us to one another. He clenched both buttons in his fist and smiled through his tears. "Yes," he said. "I think I'm ready." Several days had passed. Avery couldn't get his conversation with the old man out of his head. His words about his mother were the warmest Avery had ever heard. But with each passing day, more and more questions arose. How did this man know so much? Why had he told Avery these things? It felt as if he was holding on to something important, but wasn't ready to reveal it all at once. Finally, Avery decided to return to the park. The wind had grown cooler, and golden leaves crunched beneath his feet along the path. He walked slowly, thinking about what he would say if he met the man again. There was unease inside him, but hope as well. He had the feeling that this man knew even more, that he could open a door to the past Avery could barely remember. And there it was, the same bench. Avery's heart stopped for a moment. Just like before, the man was there, sitting with his gaze lost in the distance, his fingers slowly turning a small button. Avery stepped forward cautiously. This time he didn't hesitate. He sat down beside him. For a while they said nothing, just listening to the wind as it moved through the trees. "I knew you would come back," the man said gently, without turning his head. Avery looked at him. His heart was pounding, and a strange anticipation filled his chest. "Why did you tell me about my mom?" he asked. "How did you know her?" The man sighed, ran a hand over his knees, and after a pause he spoke. "When I was younger, I worked at the library. Your mother used to come there often. She loved books and always took something new home. But more than anything, she loved bringing something back for you. I remember one time she picked out a book of fairy tales and said, 'This world can be too heavy, but I want my son to always believe in kindness.'" Avery felt something shift inside him. He didn't remember this, but he could picture it. His mother holding a book, smiling. Her warm voice, her gentle hands. She always left little traces of herself, the man continued. One day at the library she forgot her glove. When I found it, there was a small red button in the pocket. Back then I thought it was just a coincidence. But now I understand, it was her way of leaving a reminder. Avery clenched his fist. Now he knew these buttons really did mean something. But the man wasn't finished. She came even in the rain, even when she was exhausted, he added, his voice growing softer. One day, I asked her why she was always in such a hurry. And she said, "When you have someone to live for, time no longer belongs to you." Avery listened, barely breathing. He had never heard these words before, but he could feel them settling inside him, filling the empty spaces in his memory. She was incredible, the man whispered. She was a light to those who knew her. Avery swallowed the lump in his throat and looked down at his hands. For a second, he thought that if he closed his eyes, he might hear her voice again, feel her hand resting on his head. "Thank you," he whispered. The man only nodded, his gaze fixed on the distance. Then slowly he placed something into Avery's hand. A small sky blue button. "Her favorite color," he said simply. Avery clenched the button in his palm, and warm tears rolled down his cheeks. Several days had passed, but Avery couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. He couldn't shake the feeling that their talk wasn't over yet. The man knew so much, and now Avery had even more questions. That day, he found himself back in the park. He walked along the familiar paths, his heart beating faster at the thought that he might see him again. The wind swayed the trees and leaves danced slowly in the air, as if performing a farewell dance before autumn arrived. When Avery reached the bench, he felt both relief and joy. The man was there, sitting just as calmly gazing ahead, as if he had never left. The boy sat down beside him in silence. "I knew you'd come," the man said, a faint smile on his lips. Avery nodded. "I want to know more," he said quietly. "Tell me more about my mom." The man looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small button, this time a green one. He held it in his palm and began to speak. "Your mother. She always found beauty in simple things. She believed that even the smallest gesture could make someone's day better. Once I saw her give a stranger a flower, for no reason at all. She told me that sometimes people need to be reminded that kindness still exists in the world." Avery listened, barely breathing. She collected autumn leaves and arranged them around her home because she said they were like tiny works of art created by nature. The man continued. "I remember once she found a unique leaf, streaked with golden veins, and she said, 'This leaf reminds me of those who leave us but leave behind their light.'" Avery felt his eyes sting with tears. "She truly believed that small things matter," the man said. "That's why she left you the buttons. Because she knew you would understand." The man fell silent for a moment, then took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. "She was special," he said softly. "One day when I was feeling lost, your mother walked up to me and simply asked, 'Are you okay?' It was the simplest question, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone. We talked that day, and she told me how important it is to notice the people around us. She always knew when someone needed a kind word." Avery couldn't look away. He was mesmerized, hanging on to every word. "I will never forget that day," the man continued. "Back then I was just a confused young man. And your mother helped me see that the world isn't as bad as it seems. That there is always someone willing to offer kindness, even if it's just a stranger on a park bench." A warmth spread through Avery's chest. He understood now why this man spoke of his mother so freely. He hadn't just known her, she had changed his life. "I want to be like her," the boy whispered. The man smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already are," he said gently. "You found her signs. You listen. And that means you are carrying her kindness forward." Avery took a deep breath. He felt like he knew his mother better than ever before. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand himself too. Another day, and once again, Avery found himself in the park. He no longer tried to explain to himself why he kept coming back. His feet carried him instinctively to the same bench, where the man always seemed to be waiting. Deep down, Avery knew. Something inside him had changed. It wasn't just about learning more about his mother. It was about feeling her presence. And this man with all his stories was his last connection to her. Today the man looked especially thoughtful. When Avery sat beside him, he slowly lifted his eyes and smiled warmly. "You're here again," he said gently. "I want to know more," Avery replied, his voice steady. "You've told me what she was like. But who was she to others? What did she live for? What did she dream about?" The man took a deep breath and looked into the distance, as if sifting through his memories. "She was someone who saw light where others didn't," he began. "She wrote letters to strangers. She would leave notes for waiters in cafes or cashiers in stores, just to thank them for their smile. Sometimes, she wrote words of encouragement and tucked them into books at the library, hoping that someone would find them at just the right moment." Avery stared at him, unblinking. He had never known this about his mother. No one had ever told him such things. "She loved people, even when they didn't always love her back," the man continued. "Once I saw her buy 2 cups of coffee, but she only drank one. She left the second on a park bench with a note that read, 'If you're having a hard day, just know you're not alone.'" Avery felt something tighten inside his chest. He could picture his mother doing that, with her warm smile, with that quiet voice full of kindness. "She wanted the world to be just a little brighter," the man went on. "Even when things were hard for her. Even when—" he hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "Even when she knew she didn't have much time left." The words pierced Avery, but he didn't look away. "She always said that if we could make someone's day even a little better, just for a second, then the day wasn't wasted," the man continued. "She didn't leave behind wealth or build something grand, but she left something behind, within the hearts of people who didn't even know her name." The man fell silent for a moment before speaking again. "One day I asked her, 'Why do you do this? You don't even know who will find your note, who will drink the tea you left behind.' And do you know what she said? 'That doesn't matter. What matters is that someone will. That maybe in that moment, they'll feel less alone.'" Avery swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. Now he understood why she had left the buttons. Why, even after she was gone, he kept finding them. It was her way of saying, "I'm here." "Did she have dreams?" he asked quietly. The man nodded. "She dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world. But one day she told me, 'My greatest journey is my son, and I want to walk that path with him day by day.' You were her greatest adventure, Avery. Her most important one." The words hit deep. Avery lowered his head, staring at the ground. For the first time, he wasn't just thinking about what he had lost, but about how much he had been given. The man looked at him and smiled softly. "Now you know who she was. And you know why she meant so much to me." Avery didn't ask who the man had been to his mother. He no longer needed to, because sitting beside him was someone who had carried her memory just as he did now. Avery found himself in the park again. By now, he had stopped questioning why his feet carried him to that same bench. Each conversation with the man made his mother feel closer, as if, after all these years without her, he was getting to know her all over again. Today the man looked different. He sat with his head bowed, his shoulders heavier than before. When Avery sat down beside him, the man didn't speak right away. For a while they just sat in silence, until he finally let out a deep sigh and looked at the boy. "Have you ever wondered what her last day was like?" he asked, and there was sorrow in his voice. Avery tensed. He had never asked about it. He had been afraid of the answer. Afraid to hear about her last look, her last words. Afraid to know exactly how she had gone. But now he knew he was ready. He nodded. The man gazed into the distance, as if reliving that day once more. It was a quiet evening. The leaves were falling from the trees, and the golden light of the setting sun filled her room. She lay in bed, too weak to move. But she was smiling. Always smiling. Even then. Avery clenched his fists. He couldn't imagine what it was like, to know your time was running out and still smile. "I was there," the man continued, his voice softer now. "I held her hand." She looked out the window, watching the wind carry the leaves. "It's beautiful," she said. "I wish Avery could see this." A sharp ache bloomed in Avery's chest. Tears blurred his vision. I asked her if she was afraid. She shook her head. No. I just don't want him to cry. I don't want him to remember me as sick. Tell him I love him. Tell him I'm always with him, even when I'm not. Avery let out a quiet sob. He could almost hear her voice, feel her hand on his head. Her breathing grew quieter, the man said, staring straight ahead, though his gaze seemed far away. And as her strength faded, she asked me to come closer. I leaned in and she placed something in my palm. A small yellow button. The last one, she whispered. For the one who will keep my memory alive. The man fell silent for a moment, as if reliving that final exchange. He held the button in his hand, but he didn't offer it to Avery. She entrusted it to me, he said quietly. Not to give it to you now, but to make sure her memory would always stay alive. Because sometimes what matters isn't what we hold in our hands, but what we carry in our hearts. Avery lowered his head and covered his face with his hands. Everything he had feared was now laid before him. The truth, the pain, the loss. But with it came something else, a feeling that for the first time he truly knew her. Completely. The man placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She left this world in peace, knowing you would grow up with her love, knowing you would find your way. Avery didn't answer. He just sat there, letting his tears fall freely. He wasn't ashamed of them. He didn't try to stop them, because in that moment he understood. Crying wasn't something to fear, because remembering meant loving. After that last meeting, Avery came to the park every day. He would sit on the same bench, waiting for the man. A restless feeling stirred inside him. Something told him that their conversation wasn't finished. He wanted to ask, who was this man to his mother? Why was he the one telling him her stories? Why had she entrusted her last button to him? But the man never came. For the first few days, Avery reassured himself that the man was simply busy. Then he started making excuses. Maybe he was sick, maybe he had traveled somewhere. But weeks passed, and the bench remained empty. Autumn gave way to winter, the first snowflakes swirling through the air, settling on his jacket. Every time he came, Avery hoped to see that familiar figure, to hear another story about his mother. But no one was waiting for him. That day he came again. He sat on the bench, wrapping his arms around his knees, and simply stared ahead. People walked by, sparrows darted along the path, gathering crumbs. The world kept moving, but he was still waiting. Why didn't you come? He whispered into the empty air. But the park was silent. Only the wind played with the fallen leaves, carrying them away like memories no one would repeat again. He closed his eyes, recalling the old man's voice, his warm, steady words. The way he spoke of his mother, of her kindness, of her final days. Now it all felt like a distant dream, like a story that had ended at the most important part. A pang of regret crept in. It was strange to realize that someone who had known his mother was suddenly gone, leaving behind only memories. He had wanted to hear more, to know more, but time had run out. Avery stood up, ready to leave. But then his eyes caught something small near the leg of the bench. Something tiny, insignificant. And yet it made his heart clench. A yellow button. It lay there in the stillness, frozen in time, like an unspoken answer. Like a promise fulfilled. Avery knelt down, picking it up with trembling fingers. It was the same one. The last one. The one the man had kept. Tears welled up in his eyes. He didn't know why the pain felt so sharp, but he understood. The old man wasn't coming back. He sank back onto the bench, clutching the button in his palm. It was cold, yet it felt alive, as if it still held the warmth of the hands that had once carried it. He pressed it to his chest, allowing his tears to fall. But they weren't only tears of grief. There was gratitude in them too. For the stories, for the memories, for the love. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying something away, but not everything. Some things remained. Memories remained. In words, in voices, in the story he had been told. In his mother's last words. In the days he had spent on this bench. Avery lifted his gaze to the gray winter sky. He knew no one lives forever. But if you love someone, if you remember them, then they never truly leave. What rested in his hand was not just a goodbye. It was a reminder that those we love never disappear completely. And though the bench beside him was empty now, he knew they remained. In memories, in words, in warmth that could never fade. Those we love never leave. They walk beside us unseen, unheard, but always there. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.